Welcome to the Middle East since 1945 lecture. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at key areas of the Middle East since the end of the Second World War. This is going to include the land of Israel, what we would say called Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and then of course, the post 9/11 time frame. So, without further ado, let's look first at Israel. We're going to look at Israel, then Iran, and then the modernity issue in the Middle East. Let's start looking at Israel first here. Um, the last time we left off with Israel, with British Palestine, what's going to happen is that after World War II, you get Jewish and you get Arab Palestinian terrorist groups. They're going to show up afterwards. On top of that, you also not only have, you know, terror organizations and freedom fighting organizations running around in the region, you also have a lot of Jewish people coming in, trying to get out of Europe after World War II. Remember, the Holocaust devastated European Jewry. But on top of that, many of them are trying to leave. Some of the people who are survivors of the Holocaust will go to America. Some will go to some will end up going to Britain. Some will go to Latin America. But a lot of them are going to go to what at that time was still British Palestine from 1946 to 1948. So we're going to see massive immigration. Now, the British aren't supposed to allow them in, but they're going to come in for a few reasons. One, some of them still were able to come in. Two, there's lots of basically illegal immigration during this time frame. So, large numbers of Jewish people are going to come into British Palestine, and that's going to spur on the Jewish immigration, the Jewish independence movement, as well as the Arab Palestinian independence movement. Now, the Jewish independence movement will come because they're getting more and more manpower, and a lot of angry people who are angry about what happened during the Holocaust, and they never want to have see it happen again. I'm sure you guys have heard the phrase "never again." It's referring to this. It's referring to the Holocaust, and also to people bullying Jews around. And I've mentioned before, I myself am Jewish. I firmly believe in never again. When it comes to people who want to do harm against, let's say, me as a Jew, on one hand, I'm perfectly willing to be Martin Luther King Jr. But on the other hand, there's a part of me which, if I see danger, I will very much take Malcolm X's position. But that being said, you now see a large number of Jews moving to, British Palestine, and on top of that, you also have lots of people who are, Palestinian Arab in the region. And remember, the British are building the region up, and they're trying to keep it as a part of their post-World War I empire. Now, what ends up happening is that terrorism is going to increase on both sides. There's going to be a three-way fight between the UN, the proto-Israelis, Jews, and the Arab Palestinians. So those three groups are going to be out there. And what's going to happen is that by 1947, 1948, the British effectively, they're done. They don't want to deal with this anymore. So the British are going to pack up their bags and go home. Number one, the British Empire at this point is kind of falling apart. They can't pay for it. Remember, they barely paid for World War One. Now the British can't pay for World War Two. So the price from them winning the war was essentially getting rid of their empire. This is also when we see the whole welfare state in Britain emerge. So they had an option. Do they go towards a welfare state? Or do they go keep the empire? They opt for the welfare state. So we've got a three-way fight going on. And the British are going to basically back out. They're going to turn British Palestine over to the United Nations. Now the UN's actually in an interesting position here. They've got no bone to pick. They're not British, they're not Jewish, and they're not Arab Palestinian. So they simply decide, where are the population? What would be fair to both sides? So what we end up getting is this is the UN partition plan in 1947, 1948. Here's what it looks like. We have an Arab state and a Jewish state. The Arab state would be the yellow. They've got all that yellow area here. So they have their ports. You can pop your way through here a little bit. So they've got some pretty good territory. They've got access to ports. They've got access to the Dead Sea. Pretty good. And the Jewish state of Israel would have, parts of the Golan. Again, good area here by the port. by the ocean for ports. Then also a lot of desert, and down here they have another port as well. So it was a good plan, for both sides. Jerusalem itself would be administered by the UN. Again, this is not a bad plan for both sides, both for in terms of population and geographic concerns. Now the Israelis are going to accept this plan because they're like, hey, we get a state, awesome. So they're really happy about that. However, while the Israelis accept it, the Arabs don't. The Arab Palestinians don't, and the reasoning that they reject it is because all the other states around, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and others, all those other states tell them, reject it, we're going to go destroy Israel. That's why. So, this is a huge mistake for the Palestinians. They reject the creation of a Palestinian state in 1948. And it's going to haunt them ever since because they're never getting this. They're never getting the UN partition plan. Now, the problem here is that not only do they reject the plan here, almost immediately upon Israel being created in 1948, like almost immediately afterwards, within days, um, multiple Arab nations are going to invade Israel. So multiple Arab nations invade Israel, and they're going to say things like, "We're going to kill the Jews. We're going to throw them back to the sea." And you ever hear about one Palestine from to the sea? What they mean by that is they want to kill Jews in large numbers, and this is after the Holocaust. So how do you think Israeli Jews are going to react to that? Not well. They're not going to react well to it. But what happened is that in the Israeli War of Independence from 1948 1949, the Israelis managed to hold on, and they managed to actually win. They win a lot of they win a lot of territory. They basically double the size of the country. And the reasoning that happened, the reason they doubled the size of their country, is because those Arab armies that attacked them, they're not that good. They're like playthings for like sheiks and rich kings and things like that, or rich oil barons or something. They're not really armies. The Israelis, on the other hand, they go with an all hands on deck type of fighting. Everyone fights, men and women fight. Their backs are against the wall, and a lot of them fought during World War II. You got a lot of American, British, and Soviet, veterans who fought in World War II, and then you have a lot of people who are highly motivated, especially after the Holocaust, to fight as well. So the Israelis win because they have way better training, they have way better experience, and they understand what they need to do to win, and they ultimately double the size of their country. But things don't end there. Now here's what happens: Israel's going to double the size of their country as a result of it. This becomes Israel after the 1948. Now what happened after 1948, 1949 is that the Arab states basically have at best an armistice. So the war is actually not over, and they're still fighting along the borders. There's still a lot of skirmishing over here by Lebanon. There's still skirmishing by Golan. The West Bank, is the skirmishing here along the West Bank with Jordan. By the way, Jerusalem itself was divided. Half of Jerusalem was still under the control of Jordan, who controlled the West Bank. So including Jewish holy sites, Jews from 1949 to 1967 were not able to go there. So, and then of course you have fighting along here with the Egyptians here. But what ends up happening is that we get a few things coming out of this. One, we get a new state of Israel, which is now effectively its own country. But at the same point, there's a lot of countries that want to get rid of it. Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and others want to get rid of this Israeli state. And the Palestinian people don't get their own state because Jordan absorbs the West Bank and Egypt absorbs Gaza. So at this point here, they don't get a state; they simply get absorbed by other countries. And as a result of that, and this is one of the problems with the War of Independence. The West Bank. Jordan goes into the West Bank, and many of the people flee. It's not necessarily the Israelis' fault that they fled. I mean, one, they're fleeing war. Two, they're fleeing because both sides are going to be in their area. Same thing in Gaza. Are there atrocities on both sides? Absolutely, there are. What happens in war? There are going to unfortunately be atrocities. But I blame both sides for the atrocities, equally. So we get a bunch of wars. There's a 1956 war. I'm not going to go over that one, but I'm just mentioning there is a 1956 war. It's a training for the Israeli military. It doesn't really change borders, but it happens. The big ones in 1967 and 1973. Now, what happened in 1967 is that by that point, it's been about 20 years of since the foundation of Israel, and we've got some major new leaders running a bunch of countries here. We've got new leaders in Syria, we've got new leaders in Jordan, and we've got new leaders in Egypt. Nasser in Egypt is going to be incredibly important. Um, you know, General Nasser, when he takes over as the leader of Egypt, he's going to be doing this pan-Arabism plan, where all the Arab countries should band together and fight as one. So there's this Arab nationalism, and he's also hanging out with the Soviets, so he's on the Soviet side of the Cold War. Um, on the opposite side of things is the Israelis, who are obviously playing with the American side, increasingly so. And they got a lot of support from American Jews, also from the British government, the French government, and to a lesser extent the German West government. So we have essentially proxies in the Cold War. Israel on the side of the U.S. and the West. On the Soviet side, we've got the Arab countries like Egypt and Syria and Jordan. So Nasser was building up, the tension against Israel. He's going to mass his army in Sinai. Jordan's going to mass their army in the West Bank. Syria will mass their army in the Golan, and Lebanon will also mass their army as well. So and other countries can join in. Algeria, Libya, Iraq, and the Saudis. They're all going to send armies. So the Israelis look like they're about to be invaded again. And we're hearing once again from the Arabs, we're going to throw the Israelis back to the sea. We're going to massacre them. They're saying things like that again. Again, one of the biggest mistakes the Arabs ever made was not understanding the reality of the Holocaust and what it means for Jewish people around the world. So not understanding that they don't understand how the Israelis are fighting. So the inability to understand that really, really damages their ability to fight them. So, what ended up happening is the Israelis have actually built their military up quite well. The Arabs, they built their militaries up, but they're relying very much on the technology, not on the know-how. The Israelis in 1967 will actually go first. They're going to do what we call a preemptive war. The Israelis going to do is they can send the Air Force to destroy the Egyptian Air Force. The Israeli Air Force will be sent to destroy the Egyptian Air Force, and then after they destroy the Egyptian Air Force, they'll destroy the Syrian Air Force. This all happens on basically the first 3 hours in June 1967. On the first 3 hours of fighting at the beginning of the 6 Days War, the Israelis effectively destroy the entire Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian Air Force. That's an incredible victory right there. And then, in 6 days, the Israelis will take the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, and they'll take the Golan Heights. So in fact, be contemplating attacking Damascus in Syria. They'll be contemplating moving into Jordan, and they'll also be contemplating taking Alexandria. But the war ends after 6 days, and the Israelis have a smashing victory. They just took on an enemy basically about 20 times the size of them and won. And they now triple the size of Israel in 1967. And there's a joke in Israel that on the 7th day the Israelis rested. Get it? Yeah. So what happens is that in 6 days war Israel wins again, and this time they crush the West Bank and they take Gaza Strip as well as much of the Sinai and the Golan. But the Arab countries aren't done there. Ha! You got us. Good one. You beat us once. Let's see if you can do it again. So in 1973, there's another war. It's called the Yom Kippur War. Now, the Yom Kippur War happens during the High Holy Days for Jews in October. It's called the October War amongst both sides tend to call it that, but Muslims and Middle Easterners tend to call it the October War. But you can use it either way. They'll know the term either way. So what happens in the Yom Kippur War is this time Egypt and Syria go first. Jordan's not involved. Lebanon's not involved. It's just Egypt and Syria. This time both sides do a lot better. The Syrians break into the Golan, and the Egyptians break into the Sinai. Remember, Israel had conquered both. They do very well in the initial phases of the war because the Israelis were overconfident. They didn't think that they didn't think that the Israelis would be able to. I'm sorry, the Israelis didn't think that the Arab nations would attack them during this time. Well, they did, and it's going to take a while. But within a week of hard fighting, the Israelis counterattack. And in the Israeli counterattack, they already have the West Bank, by the way, just reminding you guys. In this Israeli counterattack in 1973, they take the Golan fully. They're once again on the march through Damascus, and they surround an entire Egyptian army, this time not in Sinai, but in Egypt itself. See the spot right here? Right there? They surround the Egyptian army right here. And when they surround the Egyptian army, it's all but over. But in 1973, it was way too close for the Americans and the Soviets. Why? A few reasons. It's a Cold War. Israel's on the American side. By 1973, fully on the American side. And Egypt and Syria are on the Soviet side. So they have lots and lots of tanks. Soviet tanks, I should say. By the way, this war is one of the few conflicts that showcase what tank warfare and naval warfare would have looked like during the Cold War. It's one of the few really good examples. When I teach the Cold War in like European American military history classes, I have to teach the '73 Yom Kippur War because it's the only example we have of what it would look like. Tank war in terms of tanks, in terms of planes, in terms of navy, all that stuff. But it's important because if Israel had fallen or was about to fall, Israel had about 30 nukes. Israel would have nuked the crap out of the Arab countries as a result of that. So it had serious, big, great power ramifications. On top of that, when the Egyptian army is surrounded over here, the Soviets were contemplating sending military aid in. They were considering, going to war with Israel over this. Now the U.S. said, nope, 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 you're not doing that. So the U.S. is starting to put military, navy goods, the Eighth Mediterranean Fleet, in between. You see how this can escalate? Does it sound a lot like 1914? It did. Too close for comfort. There is no other major war between Israel and the Arabs after 1973. Now, yes, there is a Lebanon war, and yes, there's been fighting in Gaza and the West Bank, but beyond that, no. Um, the major powers are no longer fighting each other, and Israel effectively through these four wars: War of Independence, 1956, 6 Days War, and Yom Kippur War. The Israelis proved their mettle in battle. They proved their mettle in it. They conquer, and the other countries realize they actually can't destroy Israel. If they destroy Israel, Israel's going to destroy them. And the Americans and Soviets don't want this anymore. They don't want escalation anymore. So what ends up happening is a few things. The Arab countries realized that after 1973, they can't attack Israel directly, but they can attack Israel economically. So, in terms of economics, it's actually going to be a combination of economics and diplomacy. But here's how it works. In the Middle East, there's lots of oil-producing countries. They are part of a consortium called OPEC. It's an organization of petroleum and energy countries. So much of the Middle East is in there. The Saudis, UAE, Qatar, Iraq, Iran was a part of it, and other countries are also a part of it as well. But OPEC is going to flex its muscle. After 1973, OPEC decides to do an oil embargo. What they're going to do with the oil embargo is block other countries, especially America, from getting Middle Eastern oil. Now, this was designed to fight economically against the Israelis. They said, if you stop supporting Israel and if you force them to give up territory, we will lift the oil embargo. So it was an attempt to economically and politically hurt Israel. The problem is it doesn't work. Most of the countries have their own other oil reserves, but on top of that, the Arab countries themselves realize we could make a lot of money just with this. So why are we going to, screw up our markets? So what ends up happening is that while the oil markets, they don't, well, OPEC, I should say, they don't get rid of Israel, it does boost their oil sales. Long term, this is when the Arab countries become filthy, filthy, filthy rich. In fact, check out the movie American Hustle. You see the whole plot in that movie set in the 70s and 80s. The whole plot of that movie essentially is, a fake Arab, sheik, trying to get involved in diversifying his oil money. But that being said, the oil embargo doesn't work. We'll be talking about what oil wealth means. We'll be talking about later. But for now, we can talk about that it didn't work. Economically and militarily, they can't beat the Israelis. So it leads to Anwar Sadat, the next leader after Nasser, taking over in Egypt. Anwar Sadat is interesting. What ends up happening is that Sadat negotiates with the Israelis instead. Well, Anwar Sadat, there he is right here. In 1978, Sadat is going to do what we call the Camp David Peace Accords. He can come to America. He's going to work with Menachem Begin. That's him right here. Then Jimmy Carter is the intermediary between them. By the way, one of the few things Jimmy Carter did that was good as a president. I will give him credit for this, but mostly he sucked as a president. But what happens is that we get a land for peace policy here. Israel gives up the Sinai. I'll go back to it for a second here. They give the Sinai Peninsula in return for peace. Egypt meant it. That's the big difference here with everything else. Egypt meant peace. So Anwar Sadat, he made peace with Israel, and he completely recognized Israel in terms of the Sinai, ended the war. On top of that, not only did he do that, he opened up trade between Israel and Egypt, and there's been trade ever since. And he also shifted. Notice? Remember, I told you he was Egypt was originally part of the Soviet order. Now they're part of the American side. The Egypt under Sadat and then under Mubarak, and who replaces Sadat, Egypt does a very, very good job of switching sides. And on top of it, when they switch sides to the American side, they're on the winning side of the Cold War. They can legitimately say that. They chose wisely. But 1978 became the standard bearer for peace deals with Israel. Now, over time, they will do other peace deals. They'll talk to Jordan, and they'll even talk to Syria about peace deals. Now, with Jordan, it worked. They get peace with Jordan pretty easily. And there was an uneven peace negotiation between Israel and Syria. But outside of the Golan, Syria effectively, they weren't going to bother Israel anymore. So, after 1978, the major fighting for Israel was largely over. They still got problems in places like Lebanon. They still got problems in the West Bank and Gaza. But the main stuff against some of the big enemies is no longer there. Now, the Palestinians on their end, they're going to try first from the 1950s all the way to the early 1990s, they're going to have the Palestinian Liberation Organization under Yasser Arafat. That's a picture of him right here. Arafat is going to push Arab terrorism, and he's pushing it for a few reasons. One, he wants to use terrorism to gain notoriety and gain support. He wants the UN and he wants other countries to pressure Israel to work with them. So he's going to use terrorism to get the UN's attention. He's going to use terrorism to get Europe's attention and to try to pressure Israel through terror. Now, when I say terror, I mean just old school terror. Kidnappings. There would be bombings, but kidnappings, bombings, hijackings, things like that. This is not the stuff we're looking at today. The PLO has never done what Al Qaeda or ISIS do. I will say that. While I don't like them, they're a terrorist group and they do bad things. They don't do that. They've long not liked them. There's a major philosophical shift there. Ironically, Al Qaeda and ISIS don't really want to fight Israel because they just do not view it as a war that's worth fighting. But what happens is that this doesn't work. The terrorism doesn't work because it just pisses Israel off. Think about it. If in the United States, would you give in to terrorism? If the United States, would you give in? I wouldn't. Would you give in to people who have killed children literally in their bed? I wouldn't. And that's the problem. It just annoys the one power that Palestine needed to negotiate with just gets pissed off, and they don't negotiate. So what ends up happening is that after 1978, it becomes a concerted effort to eventually get Israel and Palestine to talk to each other, and ends up with the two-state solution at the Oslo Accord in 1993. Now, the two-state solution is this: there would be an Israel and there would be a Palestine. Palestine would include the West Bank and Gaza. Israel would be everything else. The borders could be negotiated. Trade could be negotiated. Arafat will become the head, no longer the PLO, but the Palestinian Authority, the PA, which is the government of Palestine today. Government in waiting, but it's really a government, so to speak. Now, this was brokered by President Bill Clinton, and to his credit, I think he really wanted it to work. But ultimately, it's not going to work. Ultimately, it's going to fail. And we're explaining why. So we have Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. They're going to sign the 1993 Oslo Accords. And the goal here was to create a Palestinian Authority and have Israel and the Palestinian Authority come up with a plan for a two-state solution. In theory, they would try to be another version of Camp David. In practice, it doesn't work. And it doesn't work on both sides. I'm going to go with the Palestinian side, then the Israeli side. Both sides make mistakes. Number one, the Palestinian Authority, they let Palestinian terrorism increase, intentionally, to be honest. The Palestinian Authority and Arafat thought that they could use the terrorism to browbeat the Israelis into surrender. Now, in the 1990s, there were some of the Israeli governments were pretty weak, and they didn't want to upset the apple cart. We now know as well that the Clinton administration leaned heavily on some of these groups and tried to mess with them. Meddling in other countries' politics? America? Yeah, they did. But what happens though is that we see these terror groups showing up. We see Islamic Jihad. We see the Al Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. That's part of the Fatah group. We see Hezbollah. We see Hamas. And what they'll do is they'll do bombings. They'll do raids. They'll do kidnappings. They'll do mass shootings. Anything and everything they can do to hurt and kill Israelis or anyone else who gets in their way. So here's an example of a bus bombing here where they'll blow up a bus. I remember watching live on TV. I remember watching live that you know news about a pizzeria, a Sbarro pizzeria, was bombed in Israel. And as the emergency vehicles were arriving, another bomb went off. So what ended up happening was a bomb went off at the Sbarro, and then the and then a second bomb intentionally went off against the which killed many of the emergency personnel. So the Israelis are eventually going to get fed up with the terrorism, and they're going to move to a much more interventionist military solution with the Palestinians. Now, on the other side, we have the Israelis. Now, they're going to move into the West Bank. They're going to move into the West Bank. They're going to move into Gaza, and they're going to keep building settlements. Now, if you understand Israeli politics, like the elections that have recently they've undergone, watch Israeli elections, you'll see this. If you ever watch them, you'll notice that it's parliamentary democracy. That means that you have various groups across the board, all vying for power. So you have to build a coalition government. Likud and Labor tend to be the two big groups throughout history. Or sometimes it might not be Labor, it might be some other leftist group, but it's usually Likud that shows up there on the right. So they have to work with outside groups, smaller groups, to finish building their coalitions. So we see groups on the right and the left that have outside representation, and oftentimes they right and left they have to build a coalition using ultra orthodox groups who they don't want to work, B don't want to serve in the military, and C want more land in the West Bank or want more land in Gaza. So they try to push for a greater Israel, so to speak. So what ends up happening is this: a lot of those dots are Israeli settlements in a lot of those dots are Israeli settlements in Palestine in the West Bank. Now the Israelis eventually they left Gaza and they walled out a lot of places here in the West Bank as well. But that being said, they've got all those settlements, so there's a lot of problems with it. With that. And of course, if you see Israel saying, "Well, we want peace," we want peace. But then they had these settlements. Of course, he's going to say, well, that sucks if you're on the Palestinian side. Now on the Israeli side, if you see stuff like this here, you see stuff like this. It says 50 years into 100 years war. What they mean is they want to eradicate Israel and want to kill every Israeli. So the reality is that both sides have blood in their hands for keeping the Israeli-Palestinian conflict going. But at the same point, while they do have blood in their hands, the Israelis need to stop with the settlement stuff, and they need to moderate that. On the other hand, you got the Arab Palestinians who they're increasingly becoming more and more racist. They're increasingly becoming more and more detached from the reality with Israel, what Israel is, and they become death cults. They want to kill people in large numbers. They've been teaching the school kids that Jews are essentially the same way the Nazis did. The Jewish stereotypes. They teach their kids that you know Jews do like blood libel. They suck the blood out of the children to make matzah or something. Again, racist stuff. Is completely not true. So what they'll ultimately do is create a death cult where they seek to destroy but not build. And I need to point out, a lot of the Arabs in these areas here, especially in the West Bank, that are running the government, they're not putting the money to the people. They're putting the money in their own back pocket. So it keeps much of the region poor when it shouldn't be. But hopefully things are getting better. A lot of the rest of the Middle East, outside of Palestine, is increasingly becoming, if not approving of Israel, grudgingly approving of Israel. There are Kuwaiti, Iraqi, Saudi, there pundits and political figures. They've been saying Israel has a right to exist. Why are we bothering them? We should make peace with them. We should trade with them. And as a matter of fact, in Israel, not that far from right about here actually, there's going to be like right here on the map, right here. The Saudis are going to build a city called Neom, and the whole point of it is to be a free city where anybody can go. And basically, it's designed to bring Israelis in. The Saudis want to make peace with Israel. Kuwait wants to make peace with Israel. And other countries are starting to recognize, there's no point in fighting them anymore. We should make peace with them, trade, call it a day. But hopefully this hope for the future. The Palestinians are starting to put more money into their system. They are starting to put more money into the West Bank. They are making skyscrapers in the region. So it's hopeful there. But let's look at what's going on in Iran. Now we've looked at Israel. We're going to look at now another area called Iran. Prior to the Iranian Revolution, we had a very, very authoritarian government. The Shah of Iran that had ruled Iran since the early 1920s. They had an oil economy, but they were very, very modern. They wanted a very modern country, but the problem with their modernity is that it was very, very, very much for just rich people. It was not for everyone. So the Shah is going to create in Iran where maybe a few cities were very modern, but the country itself wasn't, and people were either repressed or simply left out. But it was very modern. I mean, Star Wars played. First run Star Wars, 1977. It was in Iranian theaters. Huge movie. They loved it. Iranian women look just like we do. They dress just like we did. But what happened is that the Shah was a dictator, and he maybe isn't Hitler. He was a dictator, and what happens is that in 1979 we have the Iranian Revolution, and eventually this guy here, the Ayatollah Khomeini, he's going to overthrow the government, and when he overthrows it, he's going to bring in a Shi'i Muslim theocracy. This is basically religion as politics here. And now Shi'i is one of the branches of Islam. I'm not going to go heavily into it. Let's just say they're Shi'i. I think roughly means party of Ali. That's actually what it means. Long story. But that being said, Khomeini is going to try to he's going to try to turn the clock back. He wants to get rid of modernity, and he wants to get rid of Western concepts of liberalism. So he's going to go back to creating a Shi'i version of the world. So what he's going to do is he's going to shut down lots of classical liberal concepts. There's no free speech. There's no freedom of religion. There's no freedom of association. Women are going to be pushed backwards. They're going to have to wear the hijab or burqa. And many of the dissidents involved are going to be executed or arrested. So large numbers of people are going to be executed. Large numbers of people will be tortured. And the result of it, if you see the movie Argo, you'll see a lot of this stuff in there. But the result ultimately in Iran is going to be that it's going to pull itself away from the worldview it had, and it's become much, much more militant. Now, this new militant Iran is going to be pushing Islamic radicalism inside of Iran against its own people and then outside as well. They're going to become a big supporter of anti-American Islamic terrorism. So they're going to reject the West, they're going to reject America, and they're going to fight against Israel. Now, part of doing that is an us versus them mentality, and what can we attack versus what can't we attack. So all that stuff is there. Now, we're going to see this come to a head with what we call the Iranian-U.S. hostage crisis in 1979. You see a little bit of this in the movie Argo. But what happened here is that the Revolutionary Guard of the Ayatollah, they're gonna arrest and hold hostage Americans who served in the embassy. So the U.S. embassy in Tehran, they're gonna be arrested and they're gonna be held for over 444 days. And here we have a picture of it here. Here we have a picture of some of the hostages being paraded around, and they pretended to kill them multiple times. These people live their lives in fear, like really fear. So the U.S. government was negotiating with Iran under Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter was completely ineffectual with this. One of the reasons why he lost his second term as presidency was over the Iranian-U.S. crisis. But this was really important for the Ayatollah because it allowed him to be seen as doing something, fighting against the Americans, beating up the Americans, and so on and so forth. It was seen as him doing something. So, fighting against this was like a spigot, so they can turn the spigot on and off for water, turn the faucet on and off for water, and they would be able to use it and put all the anger and resentment of Iran and put it towards America and put it towards Israel and put it towards the West. Now, eventually, when Ronald Reagan becomes president, literally a few hours before the hostages were released, they had already been negotiating with Reagan, and Reagan said, "Would you like to keep Tehran?" And they said, "Yes, we would. You can have your hostages." Reagan would very well have launched military airstrikes against Iran if you didn't get them out. But this is an example of where Iran is. And Iran has been basically stuck in this cycle since then. The people want to be Western today. The country has modernized, I will give them that, but there's still decades. They're not. It's not like Saudi Arabia or UAE. It's not like that. It's not like any of those areas there. And Iran still remains in many respects a pariah for the support of international terrorism. They're the ones heavily bankrolling groups like they're bankrolling groups like Hamas. They're bankrolling Hezbollah. Other groups. They're bankrolling them, and in fact, some of Bin Laden's family currently live in Iran. So they've been helping out in some of those instances. Yes, Iran has been fighting against ISIS, but at best, that wasn't the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation. There. But that being said, what does the Middle East look like today? Well, we have a few things that we have to talk about. One, when the United States won the Cold War, the United States is going to turn its attention to the Middle East. They needed to protect the Middle East because it was a strategically important area thanks to oil. And the United States was also willing to seek change in the area because the Iranian situation obviously was out there. Iran is, like I said, even today is still a possible threat to the United States. Even though the people might want freedom, the government won't give it to them. So Iran eventually will have to be confronted, hopefully peacefully, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. So the United States is now the great power after the Cold War. So there's now Pax Americana. America's going to be the one who dictates the Cold War, post-Cold War peace. Leads to the first Gulf War with Saddam Hussein, who you see his picture there. Saddam Hussein tried to fill that vacuum after the Soviets left. He had a massive army. He's going to first fight a war against Iran. It's a draw. Nobody wins it, but it causes mass destruction. Then he fights the Kurds, and he pushes them off. And then he's going to invade Kuwait. And when Saddam invaded Kuwait, an American-led coalition, including Saudi Arabia and Egypt, is going to stop him. So after 1991, Saddam was defeated, but he was able to retain his country. The goal was at this point in the conflict between the Americans and Middle Eastern powers was to simply free Kuwait. So the Americans and the coalition are going to free Kuwait. They're going to establish a Pax Americana. And this is really the last conventional war anyone has really fought, since Cold War ended. But there's a lot of issues in the Middle East that come along with that, and it's going to lead to the rise of things like Al Qaeda, but also to the rise of modern, modern nation states like Saudi Arabia. I'm willing to call Saudi Arabia a nation state because there's a lot of oil money. In a lot of these countries, the oil money has allowed them to diversify their economy and to go far, far, far beyond just being an oil producer. Sorry. Now, oil money is going to allow them to have lots of money, allow them to have access to modernity, access to riches, and of course, access to decadence. So, on one hand, you'll probably have a Saudi, prince investing in, nuclear technology to make safer thorium reactors. Or you could have somebody in UAE investing in, heart medicine. But at the other end, you also have people who invest in Islamic fundamentalism. So on one hand, you have stuff like this where you have here's Riyadh, very modern city, and then you have in Riyadh, this is it here, a guy wearing very, very traditional Saudi or Middle Eastern garb, but working with the same equipment we're working with. He's probably sitting there saying, "My computer is slow. Why do they give me very little RAM? Or something." So the same. He's living the same world we live in. He's he's drinking the same coffee we drink. He's playing the same video games we play. Listening to maybe not the same music, but hey, he would be perfectly happy to listen to metal just as much as I would, and I'd be perfectly happy to listen to his music just as much as he would. So these are people who are of the world, but not everyone is. The new state power of countries like Saudi Arabia and others is going to push a lot of people to the wayside. Not everybody's happy with modernity. Not everybody wants 21st century. There are, of course, you've heard of the Amish. There are people who reject it, and there are others who reject they reject modernity because they view the world through their religious or their ethnic identities. And what ends up happening is that we get groups like Al Qaeda coming out of that. Now, before I go to Al Qaeda, they're on the margins of all this. By and large, we get very, very powerful countries like, again, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Abu Dhabi, Oman, Kuwait. They're all good examples of this. And a few things I need to point out with it is that they don't really think in terms of democracy the way we do. They think in terms of tribalism. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. There's going to be multitude of governments out there. Here's how their tribalism works. It's actually effectively democratic, ironically. Here's how it works. In Saudi Arabia, everybody is part of the House of Saud. They're either an outside tribe brought in and intermarried into the House of Saud, or they're always a part of it. The people within it, they get the oil money. The government is run by basically the main family, but they work with the tribes within the House of Saud to spread money downwards. So you got tribal leaders and tribal officials who essentially work to push money downwards. So we have almost a Republican, form of tribalism, you know, with the tribal leaders effectively acting as congressmen, getting money and then sending it where it needs to go, either to the state or to the individual people running the country. Or individual people in the country. So, and this just generally works. It works because they have to barter amongst each other. So there's checks and balances for all these different groups. And it generally works to A, maintain the peace, and B, build the country up. You know, but there are people, like I said, who are on the wayside of all that. And what happens is that the people on the outskirts, they're reactionaries. They might be reacting to what they consider to be, you know, illegitimate, they might be reacting to what they think is an illegitimate, cultural, sphere, where women are allowed to show their faces or show their bodies. They might not like that America is strong. They might not like that Christianity or Judaism is strong. Um, and many of these people are upset because their own lives don't work. If you ever follow the Boston Marathon bombers, the older brother of the Tsarevs, he was a failed boxer, and he falls on Islamism not because he believed in faith, but because the faith let him have a scapegoat and blame everybody else for his failures. See how it works? So groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS and Islamic Jihad and Islamiyah Jamia and others, groups like those, they're going to push a worldview where their Islamism allows them to absolve responsibility for their sins in many respects. This is a religious fanatic across the board. They're rejecting modernity, and they're rejecting their own responsibility for modernity or for their own mistakes. And so Al Qaeda is going to rise up in the 1980s in the middle of the Soviet-Afghani War. Um, the Soviet Union in the 1980s is going to invade Afghanistan, and it's going to go pretty bad for the Soviets. The Afghanis, they fight back extremely well, and not only do the Afghanis fight back well, the Afghanis are helped by the Americans, the Pakistanis, and the Saudis. The Saudis are going to fund a whole bunch of groups in a whole bunch of freedom fighters in Afghanistan, most of whom were just good people. And at this point, one of the groups is Al Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden. He was a young guy at the time. He was an architectural engineer. He was that's what the Bin Laden family does. They build. They're architects. They designed the stadiums and arenas around the Kaaba and in Mecca, for instance. That's actually their job. But he was already been kicked out of the family, so he was persona non grata. But he's going to go to Afghanistan, take his money with him to Afghanistan, and he's going to fight against the Soviets. He'll do okay. And I need to make a point here. The Americans did give him some weapons. They gave him a bunch of guns. That's it. They didn't give him anything heavier. They didn't trust him. All they said was, oh, let's have some ties. Let's go meet him. Let's give him a few machine guns and call it a day. That's all we did. So if anybody says, America created Al Qaeda, stop. We didn't. They're just trying to say that because America created everything bad. By the way, whenever somebody says that, America caused 9/11, America caused Pearl Harbor, America created Al Qaeda. But you know what they're actually saying? White America created these things. All these other people who are not white couldn't. It's actually a racist argument there. So, yes, the Japanese did Pearl Harbor. Yes, Al Qaeda was financed partially by the Pakistanis and partially by the Saudis. And yes, Al Qaeda did 9/11. So the Soviet-Afghani War gave Bin Laden his first start, so to speak. And in the 1990s, he's going to offer his assistance to the Saudi Arabia to fight against Saddam. The Saudis realize, well, we'd like to not have to have our country invaded first. We'd like to not have that happen. So we'd like to. So if that to avoid that from happening, we're not going to take Osama's idea. Osama's plan was to let Iraq invaded, and his forces would counterattack with guerrilla war. Do you want your country being invaded? I don't. Um, so the Saudis chose wisely, and they chose to side with the United States. And the U.S. beats the Iraqis, and Saudi Arabia is fine. But Osama was pissed. He didn't like that. He didn't like that he was slighted. He thought that he'd be the conquering hero coming home. Well, he could fight, but it wasn't. He was fighting the wrong war. And so now in the 1990s, he hates the Saudis. He hates the Americans. He hates the Russians. So he's gonna essentially create himself as a third way against the Middle East or the West, or the East, depending on which one you look at. By the way, he viewed East West as the same. So third way, East West, or is Saudi Arabia and their Islamic friends. Now that being said, what Bin Laden's going to do is he's going to round up a lot of people who are disaffected by modernity, and he's going to let them. He's going to turn them into jihad warriors to fight a jihad struggle against the West, East, and other Middle Eastern countries. By the way, jihad in theory, is, we think it means to attack infidels, to attack non-believers. In reality, it means to struggle. That's it. It means you struggle against something and you overcome it. Like I'm struggling against an addiction, or I'm struggling to improve my grades, or I'm struggling to overcome the smoking, something like that. It's like a personal struggle against your inner demons. That's really what it means. It does not mean go fight enemies. That's not what it is. So what happens is that in the 1990s, he's going to stage spectacular terror attacks. World Trade Center bombing in 1993, the Kobar Towers in 1995, the embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, the USS Cole bombing in 2000. And there's others too. All sorts of bombings he does. And the whole point of these things is these are spectacular attacks is to drum up propaganda for him and to drum up support for him. Hey, he's powerful, he's winning, he's fighting. He gets lots of support. He gets lots of money. So he gets lots of support from that. And on top of that, the United States and the West viewed Al Qaeda and viewed terrorism as they'd had since this really 60s and 70s as a police action. Back in the day, our groups like the Palestinian, they would hijack a plane and say, we want to be taken to this country and release all these political prisoners, and they would let everybody off the plane, probably wishing them well, and then moving along. And then either A, they would get what they want, or B, they would die in the shootout on an empty plane. So typically speaking, it wasn't about people or killing people. It was about establishing your narrative, establishing your agenda. Al Qaeda was different. Al Qaeda was actually trying to kill people, but they were using their terror attacks to drum up support and to also create propaganda. So if there's a bombing, they would turn that bombing into propaganda drive for them. Get support through that. And the Americans, they responded with either police actions, or they responded by bombing some tents in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't something strategic. They weren't thinking that way. Al Qaeda was thinking about, fighting this massive strategic conflict globally, but the Americans weren't. The Americans were thinking, if we bomb a few tents, they'll go away. So it was the right intentions, but the wrong methods and the wrong desire. So in 2000, by 2000, 2001, Bin Laden and the Al Qaeda were emboldened. They were emboldened to attack the United States again, and they will ultimately attack the United States in what we now call the 9/11 attacks. Now, some of you might be old enough for it, but some of you might be young for it. But I'm from New York. I was not in New York City at the time, but I was living on the island. My dad was working in New York City at the time. He was a subway driver. Yes, my dad drove trains, and when I was a little kid, I got to drive trains with him. So it's pretty cool. But what ends up happening is that my mom wakes me up in the morning, and I go upstairs, and I see one of the towers on fire. This one. right here, this one. So I'm seeing that, I'm like, that's too big to be a Cessna. A Cessna would have been maybe a small 2 or 3, like this much right here, just this much. So it wouldn't be that massive. Maybe the size of 2 or 3 classrooms at Central State or any other college out there. So what ended up happening is I saw the second plane hit live. I see this live, and I realized, because I was doing research on Al Qaeda, I knew who they were. The only group with the operational or strategic range and reach to do this would be Al Qaeda. Now, what ended up happening after that, my family frantically tried to get in touch with everybody. My dad got the last train out of New York City. He made it to the island in time. I had a lot of family who was supposed to be down there. They weren't there, so I didn't lose anybody. But it was really touch and go for that day. It was really touch and go. And the Al Qaeda got a major victory on 9/11. They toppled the Twin Towers. They almost got the decapitation strike in D.C. The plane that hit the Pentagon was actually aiming for the White House. And they crippled the U.S. economy for a few weeks. But here's the thing: I call it a failure because they really didn't have the ability to do another attack like that. Just like the Japanese, they threw their best shot and they lost. What ended up happening after that is that nation states realized that groups like Al Qaeda can no longer be treated as a police action. That they need to be eradicated. So we get the global war on terror as a result of it. Now there are domestic problems with the global war on terror. We're dealing with surveillance issues today. But that being said, what ended up happening is that I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. One of the first people who called then President Bush was the Chinese government. The Chinese government said, "What do you need?" Because this could have very easily been Beijing. The Russians said the same thing. "What do you need?" This could very easily have been Moscow. See what I mean by it? Every major country was sitting there saying, "What do you need?" Because it could have easily been them. Even Cuba, Castro was offered help. And Castro and America hate each other. Even Cuba was sitting there going, "What the heck just happened?" And I know a lot of my Muslim students I've had in the past were also sitting there saying, "What do we do?" How is America going to react? They were both hopeful but also fearful about America's reaction. But what happened is that there was a global war on terror afterwards. And it's not just Islamic terrorism; it's all kinds of terrorism that can be fitting under that banner. So what ends up happening is the United States and much of the world work together to fight against terrorism. Now I'm going to ignore the anti-war movement in America. I'm going to ignore some of the Sturm und Drang about political stuff. But here's what happens. Within 10 years, Al Qaeda is destroyed. Um, Al Qaeda was defeated in Afghanistan. Al Qaeda was defeated in Iraq. Osama bin Laden is dead, and most of the original people who were involved in 9/11 and also the attacks in the 90s are dead. Al Qaeda has effectively ceded itself to ISIS. Um, so what ended up happening is that the defeat of the defeat of Al Qaeda and also the defeat of the Iraqi government and the resistance in in Iraq, um, it essentially means that while terrorism is still out there and they will be a threat for decades to come, still they don't have the same reach they used to. If you look at what's happening, at best they can really reach places like Europe and not as frequently as they used to, and they have to work with people who are in Europe. They can't project well anymore. And they've lost a lot of support. Look at ISIS today. Trump comes into power within 6 months. ISIS is mostly gone. And a few weeks ago, ISIS was destroyed. And the what ends up happening though is that in the Middle East they have a bunch of options now. There's been an Arab Spring. Some places handled it very very well. Tunisia handled it extremely well. Other places didn't. Syria imploded, and it broke out into a civil war. And from that civil war, we got ISIS. The remnants of Al Qaeda in the Middle East created ISIS, invaded Iraq, and invaded Syria, and tried to invade other countries but failed. An anti-ISIS coalition formed as a result of that. The United States was involved, the Saudis were involved, the Russians were involved, even the Iranians were involved. But with that being said, ISIS itself was defeated. But the long-term result is now a much more stable Iraq. I'm gonna ignore also that former President Obama should never have left Iraq. That's one of the reasons why ISIS was created. I'm also going to ignore the fact that he called them a JV squad when they clearly weren't. I'm going to ignore those mistakes. But what ended up ultimately happening is that ISIS was destroyed. And they're still out there, but they're not a quasi-nation state. And the Arab Spring has a chance to really flourish in multiple countries. And we're seeing one of the long-term ramifications of it in Saudi Arabia with Mohammed bin Salman. And also many of the Gulf states are pushing in a similar direction too. They're embracing responsible, I would call this responsible modernity. They're embracing taking their oil money and taking their wealth and not just diversifying it, but also enhancing the cultural awareness of their people. Mohammed bin Salman wants to modernize Saudi Arabia. He wants to bring Saudi Arabia into the 21st century, not just economically, but also politically and culturally. So he's trying to bring in much more support. Yes, I know he was involved in the death of a Jordanian, I'm sorry, a Saudi journalist. But I'm going to be honest, the journalist was working for Al Qaeda. He had Al Qaeda ties and ISIS ties. He was not a good person. My personal view of it is, I really don't have a problem with him no longer breathing. He's not a good person, and I don't really have a problem with that. Was it clumsy? Yes. Should he have done things behind closed doors? Yes. But at the same point, Mohammed bin Salman is the future for Saudi Arabia. I have Muslim students now learning Hebrew. Why? Because they want to work with Israel. They see it coming. I have Muslims. I have Muslim students talking about working with American companies, and openly doing so. And they also, I have a lot of people who are hopeful, and almost to a man and woman. They're also very much anti ISIS. So the one good thing that ISIS did was it showed them the inhumanity of Islamic radicalism, upfront and personal. So they took responsibility for it and they fought them. Go look online, you'll see countless videos of anti-ISIS marches throughout the Middle East where they're trying to tell each other we're not ISIS. And there are millions of people who did these marches. Very much in the vein of Martin Luther King, by the way. They're marching to showcase solidarity against ISIS. The Saudi did it. Kuwait did it. The people in Iraq did it. People in Syria did it. All across the world. And they did it. And this is ultimately the failures of Al Qaeda and the failures of ISIS. They tried to bully people into rejecting modernity, and they walked headlong into the reality that they were never strong enough to really attack America and topple it. They can hurt America, but if they can't take America's counterpunch, they shouldn't have bothered in the first place. America's counterpunch was the war on terror, and on top of that, increased relations with the Middle East, increased cultural relations with the Middle East, and the Middle East response in turn, long term in return, was yes, modernity is something we need. We're going to be a part of the world, and hey, hopefully there'll be a bright future. Hopefully, Iran will eventually become a free country, and hopefully, Saudi Arabia will one day have their women serving alongside the men in their government. And I mean a good example of this is I'm a big wrestling fan. And the WWE is going to Saudi Arabia. Um, they want to have, and they negotiated for this, women wrestling in Saudi Arabia. Think about that. Think about what that means. Women wrestling in Riyadh. That's huge. That's really important. And Afghanistan itself, it's much more viable than it used to be. I mean, Al Qaeda and the Taliban supporters, they have some of the hidden links, but that's all they have. They don't have anything really beyond that. They can't project themselves beyond that. So the hope in the Middle East is, long-term peace. The hope is places like Saudi Arabia and Israel, and Jordan could lead the way, and that Iran could one day become free. That Afghanistan could, one day fully be a part of the world economy, and that Maybe one day Pakistan will get its head out of its ass and stop being a failed nation. I don't think so, but that's a separate story. Um, so all these things, they're now possible. And that can only happen because Al Qaeda decided to piss America off and set all of this in motion. So therefore, I don't call it the rise here of Al Qaeda. I call it the failure of Al Qaeda. I will leave you over here with the hope of a great future. Have a good day. I'll see you next lecture.